Good evening, everyone. Welcome to OBM Network's second ever webinar. My name is Martinez-Onstott, and I will be presenting on instructional design in higher education. I provided some resources that you can find on my Twitter, so subscribe to my Twitter feed and feel free to download those. If you have any questions after this presentation, feel free to email me, follow me on LinkedIn, and we can also connect on LinkedIn if you prefer that. Before I get too much into the topic, I quickly want to gauge your familiarity with the area. So, on a scale from 1 to 5, how familiar you are with instructional design? Would you consider yourself a subject matter expert? Have you worked on a few projects? Have you read a few books about it? Are you at least familiar with ABA or OBM, applied behavior analysis or organizational behavior management? Or are you just new to the field and interested? Which, if you are, that's great. Cool. So some of you consider yourself subject matter experts. It's great to see. Everyone seems familiar with it, and everyone falls under behavior analysis. So I'm going to not spend too much time talking about what instructional design is and more on what we did. So what industry vertical would you most closely associate yourself with? Education, human services, healthcare, finance, tech, manufacturing, construction, government, or other. Okay, it looks like a lot of you are in human services. That's a few in education. It's great to see. Not surprising. I'm guessing those in human services, BCBA is working in like an autism center. Cool. Yeah, that's what I thought. Cool. What behaviors do you primarily engage in? This excludes responding to emails and attending meetings. Everyone does that, and that does not count as part of your work, even if it does. Creating and delivering training, coaching, conducting assessments, hosting workshops, instructing, researching, or other. Right? Respond. Some of you do assessments, some of you create and deliver training. That's great to see. Other, I'm guessing others program work, working on like skill acquisition or problem behavior reduction, that kind of stuff. Okay, cool. That's what I thought. Yeah, typical BCBA work. All right. Before I get into this presentation, I wanted to first focus on where the need occurred and why they brought us in the first place. And the way I'm going to illustrate this is through an example. So on the right hand side of the screen you see an image of a building on its side. Now this building fell in Shanghai and it was brand new construction, and what happened was, if you look at the buildings in the back, they look a lot like the one that fell over. What happened was, it was an urban setting and they didn't have much space. So in order to place a new building, you have to first dig a hole in the ground for the foundation. And so they had dug a hole in the ground, and being that was close to this building, whereby they weakened the foundation of the building that has now fallen over. As they were digging the dirt out, they had to store it somewhere, so they put it on the other side of the building. So on one side you have this huge pile of dirt, on the other side you have a huge hole. And that night it rained, and the rain made the pile of dirt heavier, and that essentially put enough pressure on this building's foundation that it broke. It was a sheer failure. The point of the example is that there was nothing wrong with the design of the building, there was nothing wrong with the construction of the building, there was nothing wrong with the building. The building was fit for its environment, or its intended environment, I should say. What happened was the environment changed and no longer supported the building, which was the hole and the pile of dirt. And this is much like what happened to the program. So going to the program I'm working with my team, it was a large program, and one of the great things about a large program is that success begets success. So it was growing continually. So year over year, they were seeing continued growth, which meant more resources were needed to maintain the program as they brought on more faculty, and so on and so forth. Well, a few environmental factors occurred outside of the organization that had a very significant impact on the way they did business. First, there was a recession, and this recession delayed the retiring of certain individuals in the field, so it messed up the predictions of when people would retire, so it made it a bit harder to get a job in the field. The second was there was an increase in the difficulty of the certification exam. This increase in difficulty made it harder for students to pass, obviously, but more importantly, it made their success or pass rate drop. And when a program's pass rate drops, even a little bit, but in this case it was quite significant, they become a less preferred program. So as a result, they had fewer applicants applying. So the ranking of the program fell because the difficulty of the exam increased. Those that had graduated were struggling to get jobs because it was a saturated job market. So fewer people were applying to the field in general, and fewer people were applying to this program specifically because of the loss in ranking. So in order to maintain the largeness of the program, they had to widen their net, as it were, accepting more students with a variety of backgrounds, which led to more difficulty in instruction. So the instructional system was fine for the given environment. The environment changed, and the instructional system was no longer adequate. In addition to the instructional system no longer being adequate, they started letting in students who were lacking prerequisite skills that were assumed for students to have going into this kind of setting. So they needed additional instructional supports even if the pass rate of the exam had stayed the same. So in essence, it wasn't that they have a bad program per se, it was just that the external environment changed and their program no longer satisfied the needs of the external environment. The key stakeholders for this project I've lumped into three categories: students, faculty, and administration. With students, they're the ultimate stakeholders. They're the ones who are the representatives of the organization, as well as the ones who actually benefit from the product of the organization. So they're the ones who are passing or failing the exam. So the quality of the program definitely impacts their success. The ranking of the program impacts their success with getting hired for a job. The faculty, any work we did impacted them directly because it might have meant they had to change the way they taught, as well as they're a stakeholder in the sense that if the program succeeds, they keep their jobs. If the program fails, they lose their jobs. Administration was a stakeholder because they were ultimately responsible for making sure whatever recommendations we made were implemented with integrity, meaning that semester over semester, term over term, they were following the protocol set before them and they weren't going back to their old ways. They also were ultimately the body that funded the whole machine and approved budgets. Something important to note is that due to client confidentiality issues, I cannot say what university this was with, what program this was with, nor can I say what specific degree or types of individuals we're working with or training. All I can say is that it was a private, non-profit, post-baccalaureate school in the Midwest. So anyone who's already had a bachelor's, so like grad school level. The team consisted on the instructional design side of 2 project leads, and then 3 instructional designers. On the SME and admin side, which was the university, there was the associate dean, and then multiple faculty members. The consulting model we used was a collaborative approach. We looked at the offset just being present and trying to become generalized condition reinforcers. The way we did that is we talked about things that interest them, we showed interest in their needs, we gauged the success of our just general associating ourselves with other condition reinforcers by if the faculty went out of their way to approach us, the students went out of the way to approach us, same with admin, if they emailed us frequently, if they spent time engaging in conversation with us and didn't try to end conversations. These are kind of our ways to guess if we had reduced the aversive nature of our presence. And anytime a third party comes into the classroom to tell a professor how to change the way they teach or tell a student how to change the way they should study, there's a bit of buy-in required, to say the least. The next thing we did, and so the collaborative approach of course is ongoing, but we did frequent assessment. So we were trying to increase the number of tests. We have better data not only justifies our existence and our continued involvement, but it also allows us to more specifically pinpoint issues that are occurring with the program. Finally, we looked at incremental change within the programs. We realized we couldn't save every student at once because the amount of work that needed to be done, the amount of assessment that needed to be done, and the amount of change required on the faculty members' part was too great. So we set up a system of incremental change where we make minor tweaks throughout the semester and do larger tweaks from semester to semester. So planning out for the second time the course is offered or the third and so on. The product itself was developed by a collaboration of the subject matter experts. We're kind of identifying what content needs to be taught and prioritized, instructional designers picking the evidence-based tools, and the admin who are supporting the process both financially and from a policy standpoint. I divided the pain points into system, process, and performer level. I'll briefly cover systems level. Already talked about the certification pass rates, but also student retention was a huge issue, as well as having a very heterogeneous population. So a variety of students with a variety of background, and making sure they stick through the program and then passing the exam were kind of like the main things that the program's concerned about, but also the most outside our control. We have more control over process and performer level. So process level, we had limited student support, so adding student supports to help alleviate that. They relied on end of semester exams, meaning things would be going wrong for weeks before a problem was caught, and that student can be helped and given the proper support. So again, more frequent assessment allowed us to pinpoint where in the program was weak, but also when the student starts to struggle, so we can intervene. We also had an issue, and any program will have this. They have a variance in teaching methodologies across faculty. The autonomy a faculty member is given to teach the class the way they see fit leads to a more complex system with a lot more confounds and the data that can muddy it. So not only do we have a heterogeneous population now that all struggle in different areas, but we also have faculty that teach things all different ways. So intervening at the right place isn't really like surgery. It has to be this combined package that addresses a multitude of issues, and hopefully gets the most severe out of the way. Performer level, reading comprehension, we were seeing issues with understanding the material they were reading. There was also a low levels responding in class, and when there was responding, it was very muddied with uhs and ums and imprecision and lots of prompting on the faculty member's part, which also indicated a lack of fluency. So that latency to respond, that imprecision in technical language, that inability to connect concepts from example to concept to another example to another concept, indicated that the students only had a rough understanding of the material they were given, and that we were having issues across the board. Leading versus lagging measures, in case anyone's not familiar with that, I'll quickly cover it. Lagging measures tend to be more permanent product. Leading tends to be more behavior. Lagging tends to occur further along, like, for example, pass rates, student retention, GRE scores. But again, like, by the time we get the measure, it's usually too late to solve the problem for that student. Maybe we can solve the problem for future students, but not that one student. The process level measures, also, I will say this, especially at the systems level, there are so many confounds that all we can show are correlations at best, never causation. I would argue that we can never show causation, and that the correlations that we show, there are so many other confounds, we have to be very conservative with what we interpret as contributing to the success of the program. That's why we rely on the evidence in the research literature. As far as process level measures, we use exam scores, which I would argue are leading and lagging. Lagging in the sense that the student got 80% on that material, that 20% missed. Now we have to either use a third party outside of the classroom support system to try to train that 20%, or we cut our losses and move on. Leading, as it's a leading measure in the sense that past performance is the best indicator of future performance, we could be looking for trends and looking at what students might need more support than others, or what classes need more support than others, though that's a bit messier because of faculty grading. Finally, faculty self-reports at the process level. Those, again, are both leading and lagging. Leading in the sense that within class they can be kind of giving feedback on student comprehension of the material being presented. Lagging, though, in the sense that they might be talking about a previous semester or a cohort in general, or a past event that we can no longer intervene with. For example, they did poorly on a midterm, or they did poorly on the final, which is even worse. And, well, you're drawing a connection between doing poorly on a class and the way they responded in class, but now it's too late. They already performed on that test. We'll have to rely on external supports to help those students. So finally, with the performer level, exam scores lagging, and in-class responding was leading, but also is some of the most complex behaviors to measure and to systematically manipulate. But in-class responding gives us a good indication if they're understanding the material and what the faculty member's talking about. So our journey so far, in year one, again, it was a lot of pairing, a lot of attending class sessions. We introduced SAF meds to try to build up fluency because that was one of the core skill deficits. We did that with success empirically, not so much success as far as acceptance. There was a lot of pushback from students. Again, heterogeneous population. You would think if a student was going into a field, they would want to immerse themselves and so on and so forth, but we actually got a lot of pushback. It is going better now, though. Year two, which we're in, we added additional courses onto our docket that we were trying to help out with. We continued this push for increased assessments. So going from a final to a midterm and a final is not enough. We want more assessments. We want more ways of measuring. Getting more tighter in-class responding. I'm thinking, ideally, I would like choral responding, but I think we're a long way off from something like that. A more direct instruction, errorless learning approach, precision teaching, all those buzzwords in our field like that are foreign to the program. Finally, for the remainder of the time, I'm going to focus on our reading comprehension job aid, which I was primarily responsible for, and with the feedback of my colleagues, as well as some of the feedback from the program itself, we were able to tweak and refine. So the general concept behind the reading comprehension job aid is that we are looking to go from the simplest skills to the most complex skills. So if we think of skills in a hierarchical pyramidal form, in order to respond appropriately at one level, you'll need the prerequisite skills. This is not a foreign concept. It shouldn't be a foreign concept to you. It's not a foreign concept to the individuals in the program, but a lot of assumptions are made in the sense that students should already possess these skills. So I'm going to cover these more extensively in the coming slides, but essentially we're going from like a very simple tacting repertoire to a repertoire of generative responding, where the student is responding appropriately in a novel setting, and where those existing repertoires are combining and recombining to produce the appropriate response class for the given environment. That is the ultimate goal. So looking to see if they have the prereq repertoires, but also not only that, but guiding them through a process consistently. We'll hope that if they do eventually develop this repertoire, that they'll also develop it fluently. So simple identification, so basically tacting. So we're asking questions like, who are the relevant parties? What topics or concepts are being discussed? If applicable, are there any opposing topics in your concepts? So though I can't specifically mention what the specific population was studying, I can say that in the material they were reading, there were often two conflicting concepts, and they had either one concept was prevailed over the other, or there was a combination of the two. So it could be like I'm think of the old like Greek model of idea formation, where you have a thesis, an antithesis, and then a synthesis. So it could be where the thesis or the antithesis comes out as the winning concept, or there is a synthesis performed that either the student themselves has to develop, or in the reading materials they walk them through. Get walked through that process, and that is developed from there. We also wanted them to see if they could align the readings with whatever population or body of knowledge that it pertained to in a broader sense, to see if it was being taught very specifically and they're reading very specifically for that unit, or if it's starting to generalize across units and become more of a unified body of knowledge. If the students failed to answer these types of questions and pull out essentially the details and the minutiae out of their readings, it is not surprising that they couldn't then answer any of the more complicated interpretive questions. So, though one would think a graduate student should have this repertoire, not all do, and which is fine. We should develop a program that captures these skills and assesses whether or not they exist and corrects for it. So kind of going back to that thesis, antithesis, synthesis, so in order to kind of pull out these themes, I'll use the word themes for lack of being allowed to use a more specific word, using theme, let's say theme 1 and theme 2, they would also have to categorize all the sub-concepts and examples that aligned with theme 1 or theme 2. So there is a categorization component. So we also wanted to not only see if they could pull out the minutiae, but if they could align it in the appropriate category, which again allowed for a clear comparing and contrasting of competing ideas. So finally we start getting into complex identification, fine discrimination, and I want to say generative understanding. If you are familiar with Markle and Tiemann's work, this is more of the generative responding, generative repertoire. I use the word understanding because so much of this is thought and problem solving in a purely verbal form. It just made it easier to talk about what they're doing. So far, just a brief review, they're able to identify the critical details, and they're able to categorize the critical details. Now, within those critical details, they have to look at the critical attributes. So, what about that detail 1, or detail A? Let's say, what about detail A made the strongest argument? What about detail 2 made the strongest argument? What about detail 3 weakened an argument? So we're looking at them now doing a bit of interpretation as far as, okay, I understand the general concept, I can point it out, I can categorize it, but now what about it makes it important? Also, we wanted them to look for concepts missing from the reading that are required for comprehension. So this is prerequisite knowledge in the sense that it might have been from a previous reading or from another course, or it might be missing out of the text altogether. Unlike our peer-reviewed research literature, which we read a lot in graduate school as well as just day-to-day on the job, the readings that the students were assigned were already synthesized, so they left out detail, and there is essentially each reading illustrated a point. And so if the detail is left out, they may or may not be able to answer all these questions, which made the job aid difficult to look from at an integrity standpoint. But also, maybe there is a detail left out that shouldn't have been, where it was assumed that the students would be able to synthesize the information, but failed to because that detail is missing. We also wanted to again look at whether or not they're being able to tie the current reading and this current skill they're requiring, if you will, with the larger body of knowledge. So again, some generalization. We wanted to see if those verbal relations were strong or weak, and this kind of is indicative of generative understanding. Finally, we were looking at a bit of self-report on the student's part in regards to how the reading expands, redefines, or constructs a concept. So just like our research literature, as one article is released and research moves forward and another article is released, certain concepts are tweaked, redefined, changed, better understood, maybe even refuted with new research, that the student is able to tact that change. We want them to be able to see the trend. We want them to be able to quickly summarize a previous reading and saying, this was the main point, but in this other reading, which is also newer, historically speaking, something has changed, and this is what's changed, and this is why. And so we're now looking at, again, within the generative understanding the larger body of knowledge, if they can make that fine discrimination and saying how the concept is changing from one reading to the next. So now we get to synthesis, interpretation, and summation. And this component is specifically created for a few reasons. The first is the student's need to be able to quickly and concisely summarize a series of complex concepts in a very short amount of time on the fly. So in the applied setting, they have to reference readings and take the main point and apply it to a new situation, which requires having a very high level of understanding. So you can use fewer words to explain the concept. At the same time, we also wanted to give the students the ability to self-check whether or not there are missing details within their readings, as well as allow us to, from a higher level perspective, to see where things may be falling apart when everything's tied together. So the first question we ask is, what is the primary principle in the reading? So this is, now we're getting to a group of concepts. So this is, I'm looking at the synthesis, or if the thesis was rejected and the antithesis was accepted. We're looking at them to be able to pinpoint it. So again, similar to before, but now we want them to be able to say it very succinctly. And we're wanting to see if that actually matches what they previously said and the readings. We also want them to identify the critical attributes of the principle. So essentially, now that you've said it at a high level, you have to reverse relation and break it down into its critical components, much like the reading did. Then how does this reading build upon or conflict with your previous readings? And again, getting into the area of generative understanding, looking at how everything's building together, but this is more of a qualitative check for the student, as we want to see what their thoughts are, because a lot of the skills we're working on are interpretation skills and reasoning skills and logical argument creation, if you will. We wanted them to be able to give their own voice, if you will, as far as kind of like from their personal perspective, say to what extent they agree or disagree, and this is why. So we're wanting them to also advocate for or against the reading, which would make sense if you understood the population. Unfortunately, I can't tell you the population, but trust me, if they're able to do this, they'll do well in the real world. We then moved on to, again, another summary, which is almost like listing the primary principle, but we ask it a bit differently, which you lose a bit of the minutia in the way we ask it, because I'm giving you a conceptual version of the questions asked and not the actual ones asked. So this is functionally equivalent, but not topographically. So we want to check principle versus this, summarizing the reading, capturing the main concept. So with the principle, they might be talking about the primary outcome, but when they're talking about the main concepts, they're also talking about like the narrative and the examples used. And again, briefly, high level, so that if they can do it here, they should be able to do it in the real world, is the idea, in a very short amount of time. Again, even if they disagreed with the outcome, they could at least follow the flow of logic for the outcome. Finally, we wanted them to, just like in the previous step where if there were missing concepts that weren't present in order to understand the reading, we wanted them to be able to attack that. We also wanted them, if they removed a concept or an argument within the reading, if the tower cards would all fall down. So we were wanting, again, for them to rank the importance of the critical variables, which for something concrete, that might not necessarily make sense. Not all critical concepts are created equal. And just if I'm losing anyone, when I'm saying critical concept, it is required for the principle to exist, whereas like a variable concept could or could not be there and the principle would still exist. So when I'm saying a more important critical concept, I'm essentially saying that there is a matter of importance for certain concepts over the other, where if you remove one, it's a weaker principle, but it still can exist. But if you remove another, everything falls apart. Then you might say, well, it's variable. Well, then there might be varying degrees of variability, which could be good research for anyone who wants to take that on. So quickly for the Q&A, I didn't mention this earlier, and I saw a question pop up earlier in the talk, and I want to quickly address it. What kind of assessment? The question was, what kind of assessment did we use through this instructional design process? That's a great question. So I want to preface my response by saying that the need came to us. We didn't have to sell the people that they needed our work. Admin said, please help us, instructional design team, and fix our program. So from a buy-in standpoint, we did not need a formal assessment. We did a series of interviews, and we did a lot of direct observation and even narrative recording, and I'll go into that. Because of the urgency and nature of the work, there wasn't a lot of time that we could spend on analysis, and the lack of data made it very hard to pinpoint where there were issues, because if they only have one exam a semester or one exam a term, it's very hard to pinpoint where things start to break down. So the data are only so useful, and that's the hardest data we have. When I talk about like the direct observation narrative recording, we're looking at latency to respond, number of prompts the professor used, the number of opportunities students had to respond versus the number of opportunities the students did respond, if they responded accurately or not, if the faculty was using the entire lecture time or not. So we're getting to questions like this, and these are the things we're writing down. The students stumbling through answers is what I believe led other members of my team to conclude that SAF meds were the way to go in building fluency, so that they didn't stumble through so much and they could concisely state a concept or a principle. For most of the classes, it's appropriate. The reading comprehension job aid rose out of the observation that, yes, they're stumbling through the answers, but also they're not tying examples to the concepts or examples of the principles, and they're not tying the various readings together, which is the point of the way the readings work. And if students are failing to do this, it's not just a fluency issue, it's a reading comprehension issue. Anecdotally, I also observed that students were not understanding some of the basic vocabulary. I don't want to say the word. I'm going to give you an example of a word, but think of politic. They didn't understand the word politic, or they didn't understand the word something essential. Think of it like an evolutionary biologist not understanding the difference between a family and a species, or familia and a species, or not understanding the word in the process of in natural selection when talking about natural selection. These kind of basic reading comprehension issues, just from a vocabulary area, made it very difficult to determine where things were breaking down. Was it they were just not understanding the words they were reading because they hadn't had the previous exposure and history with the word, or was it not being able to tie things together? So the idea also of the job aid was, could they tie the two together? If they're having to pick out the critical components and they're not picking out the word they don't know, then they don't know, and you don't know what you don't know until you see it. So we are hoping that maybe this would prompt them to look up words as well. We did roll out the reading comprehension job aid. Students spent less time answering questions. They were able to answer more concisely. They also were able to answer more completely and with fewer prompts. So when I say completely, is they were not just answering the professor's question, but expanding upon it. So kind of the professor would ask one question, which was going to lead to another question, and then they would answer both. So showing that they had understanding of the reading, which was great. Another question. The future, so BCBAs, how does this help with BCBAs? I'm glad you asked that question. So in regards to that question, yes, what we did is useful to BCBAs. A lot of individuals in the field, anecdotally, I've seen struggle with identifying the need to look at peer-reviewed literature, but also interpret it. And if you follow my Twitter handle, there is a research article job aid that a component of it was of like a theme of the job aid I showed you is incorporated into that, and you can use that and use it with your staff. So it was inspired by this. So working on reading comprehension with the BCBAs you're working with, or if you're in an educational setting and have graduate students, maybe having them use this to help with reading comprehension of the research articles they're reading for grad school. That's a very complex skill set. A lot of complex behavior needs to happen for that in order for all that to work. As far as assessments, so the question is in regards to assessments with augmented and virtual reality, how will that affect the future? So great question, especially with the growing demand for our services across the board. I think augmented reality will allow for us to specialize. So one is specialization. So you can focus really on skill acquisition for a certain population or problem behavior with a certain population, whether it's a typical developing adult or autism. And I'll explain how that makes sense. So what a virtual reality and augmented reality do is allow you to create a higher fidelity version of your environment, and it allows you to have more control over the environment. So it's coming, more of your senses are affected, and you're able to do it from anywhere. So it's not just looking at a really pixelated small camera image of an FA. You can have multiple camera angles, you can have audio, you can have video, ideally with augmented reality. There will be some other stimuli involved that will affect other sensory modalities, where now you can have a team of specialized in the area but might have limited knowledge with transportation. Getting out there to run an assessment, you're able to do it remotely, closer to the natural environment and versus an artificial environment, which might be better. Okay, so we're hitting the 41-minute mark here. I can probably take one more question. The question is like main takeaway and main pain point. Main takeaway is, I would say, a secondary takeaway that is with faculty who are subject matter experts who are never actually taught how to teach, but were experts in their field, it is an ongoing struggle to get them to see the value of what we do. If anyone's been in an academic setting for any period of time, even if you have some of the best empirically based researchers instructing, you'll often see them not base their instruction on evidence and on data. It's like data are useful in research but not in teaching for whatever reason. I won't go down that rabbit hole too much, but my biggest takeaway was buy-in and just thinking out ways to get the best benefit for the students with the least amount of work on the faculty member. And it might mean more work on the student, but the student learns what the student does. One last question. This will only take a second. I'll address this. What research did I use for the reading comprehension job aid? It's a great question. I struggled finding research that particularly pertains to the need that I was addressing. I relied heavily on Markle and Tiemann and their work in instructional design with critical and variable attributes and the idea of concepts and of the generative repertoire and those kind of associations from a conceptual standpoint. I also relied heavily on Joling's work with Headsprout and the thinking articles, Thinking 1, Thinking 2, and Thinking 3, where he talks about how to assess reading comprehension. So the combination of the two, I would say, inspired the reading comprehension job aid, if you will. And then I hope that answers your questions. Cool, great. Thanks everyone for your time. There will be another OBM Network webinar in March, and there will be one every month in perpetuity. Thank you for coming. Take care. Bye.